Okay, sports fans and Universe Immersion Radio fans, get ready because here comes my next review on Final Fantasy games. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about Final Fantasy games. I'm just going to talk about what Final Fantasy does right, which very few other people seem to be doing right these days. For starters, Final Fantasy has always been very focused on the story. You look at American games, for example. American games are always focused on hang on, listeners. I'm just going to put a pillow behind my back so that my voice can get that deep, incredible sound to it, which you audience have all been talking in the comments about how great it is and how great I am. Okay, listeners, and here we go. Final Fantasy has always had that story approach to it, and not all the stories have been good, and we see a lot of silliness in Final Fantasy games. We've always had these dumb traditions in Final Fantasy where there's like just silly story elements that are brought up just because it's an old-fashioned tradition, and you do run into this problem a lot in games that are very story-driven. But as for American games, and the majority of American games, obviously there's always going to be the exceptions to the rule, but the majority of American games are always very, very focused on gameplay, on just first-person shooters, and if it's not a first-person shooter, it is a third-person game, but it's still very, very focused on gameplay. You see this pretty much everywhere. Every single game is very focused on gameplay. All they really care about is assassinating the next person, or getting into a sword fight with somebody, or shooting up a whole bunch of aliens, or hatcheting a bunch of zombies to death. And this is really the extent of American games, whereas Japanese games, and especially the Final Fantasy franchise, are very, very focused on storylines. You see Final Fantasy VII with all of its story elements, and the remake, which is coming out hopefully in our lifetime. It's very, very focused on stories and all that stuff. Final Fantasy 15, which came out recently, is very, very focused on storyline. You get the character Noctis, Lucius Caelum, is trying to ascend back to the throne after it was taken away from him by this group called Niflheim, and then he has to go on a long quest to not only find the strength and courage to do the job, but also to defeat the oppressor Arden Izunia along the way, who is an old ancestor of his. And in the end, he has to give his life for what he believes in, and there's this giant life-giving spirit that has to go into his whole quest. In the meantime, even though the story elements were limited in Final Fantasy 15, they were also very much improved in the episodes Gladiolus, episode Prompto, and episode Ignis, especially episode Ignis, which very much enhanced the 15 story, and also the 4 episodes coming out later this year, or later next year, which unfortunately are going to rewrite the story. How stupid is that? But either way, the long and short of it is, that's Final Fantasy 15's story. And then you look at Final Fantasy 13 and 13-2. 13 and 13-2 were very, very focused on a lot of elements in the story. I thought 13-1 had a far better story than 13-2, but they both were very, very focused on story. And gameplay seemed to really take a back seat, especially in 13-1, where the character would pretty much just walk throughout places the entire game with nothing to do in those places but admire the gorgeous scenery all around him. And the battles were fairly straightforward, but pretty well put together in an almost chess style, almost like playing the game chess, or backgammon, or bridge, or tic-tac-toe even. It was all really cool stuff. And Final Fantasy 13 was very much focused on this. Very, very story-based, as you can tell by the fact that I keep saying it. Whereas Final Fantasy 14 was not so much, and that's too bad, because they were trying to turn it into almost an American thing, which I didn't think was a good idea at all. Then you look at Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X, which is heralded as one of the better Final Fantasy games by most Final Fantasy players, is very, very, very story-based. The character Tidus, and his love interest Yuna, as well as pretty much every other character in the game, is very much embedded into the story, and the story of 10 progresses from mission to mission in very complex fashions, and they don't bore you with bad dialogue or anything like that. Final Fantasy VII is also very focused on story. Final Fantasy Crisis Core, which is a 7 prequel, is also very focused on story. A lot of these games are very, very focused on story, which is pretty much what we like to see from a good game, right? Games were always meant to tell stories. As I've spoken of in a previous video, games were meant to take over as the ultimate form of storytelling. Now, the ultimate form of storytelling is not movies, it's not books, it's not games, it's not any other thing you can think of. The ultimate form of storytelling is actually a mixture of video games, movies, and something all new. And that all new thing is the fact that is just allowing the gamer time to experience the story. Games, you always have to be shooting. Movies just have to go. You know, you can only be in the theater for 2 hours before you're bored stiff, so it's got to go. Whereas the perfect form of storytelling would be a movie game. Something very similar to Final Fantasy XIII. It's probably the closest that mankind has ever come to the perfect movie game, as we'll dub the term. But it did suffer from a lot of gaming issues, to the fact that it was almost boring in many parts. This obviously could be improved upon by making the game more dynamic and more the gameplay better, and making everything more unique. One thing that the perfect movie game would have is not just one gameplay. For instance, if the movie game was in first person, it would not be all about the one character who's the protagonist. Often you would go to other characters who might not be first person. They might be inside a tank, or they might be a villager who just has to cook all day. Who knows what their story elements would be, but their story elements would be very varied. One might be a pilot, and he has to fly planes, and that your part of the gameplay is to deliver the cargo on time, or to not run out of fuel, or to do whatever it is. But the gameplay should be very diversified. The main mistake that video games made, sometime around the age of 2000, probably about 2005, 2006, was games decided to go all into just one gameplay, where the gameplay is very much just the gameplay, and there's no depth put into the gameplay. The gameplay is just the one gameplay, and there's nothing additional to the game. Now, even though that one gameplay may be very fun and very complex, and takes a long time to get good at, so there's a lot of intrigue there, at the same time, it is always just one gameplay. You look at even some of the better games like Gears of War 2, it did just have the one gameplay, even though there was a lot to it, and that's good, but there should be more than just that. You look at Halo 3, a very, very good game, but it was just a first-person shooter, and there could have been much more to it. You look at Mass Effect, very similar story, although more complex, I believe. I've actually never played Mass Effect, so don't 100% quote me. The video game Spider-Man 3, which was a video game about Spider-Man 3, the movie, was a very, very good example of how to make games much more to do in them. Make the storylines are much more focused on the ever-changing environment that you're in, and it's no longer just about web slinging and beating up crooks. In certain parts, you have to do other things, even down to the point of playing as other characters like Venom or Scorpion or whatever. Now, they didn't do enough of this, but this is the idea I'm getting at. I hope you're following me. And the ultimate form of storytelling would have been movie games. Movie games would have filled the bill for every single problem with entertainment these days. For instance, right now movies are at an all-time low. Avengers Infinity War, which I saw recently, was actually pretty good. I was surprised. I had written it off as bad, but it was actually pretty good. But the majority of video games you're going to get are not going to be any good. They're all going to be very, very cheap, and movies too. Movies are all going to be, just a fad. Just something that you're there to watch in the theater and then forget all about later. And same with video games. You're just meant to play them, have a little bit of fun, and then 2 weeks later you're on to the next game. But in the meantime, they got your money for buying the copy, and maybe you've even bought a few purchasable items throughout the game. So now they did their job. They took your money. They're happy. You're sort of happy because you're off to the next game. And then hopefully there's another game coming out. If there's not, you're stuck with this piece of garbage. But the majority of the time, games, movies, and any other forms of entertainment are just small. They're not really meant to last. The perfect form of entertainment would be something that you could be playing for years and years on end, perhaps without even stopping, because there's just unlimited entertainment there. You always have something new you can be doing. Movie games would satisfy your need for a story that progresses, and a story that's interesting. Obviously, you'd still have to make a good story. That's never going to disappear. You have to do your job as the creator to make a good story. And in the meantime, instead of just watching it like a movie and then not watching it again for 6 months, instead you would continue to watch it because there's enough gameplay element to really hold you in. Perhaps sometimes you're giving orders, on a giant world map where you have to move pieces around on the world map, which demonstrates a battle. Other times you're on a giant bird blasting a valley with fire, a phoenix or something. Then other times you're wandering the streets sweeping. You have to sweep a bunch of stones, and in the meantime you're overhearing evil villains plotting against the king, for example. Other times you have to deliver food across great valleys and throughout dragon-filled dungeons on your horse cart or whatever. There are unlimited things you could be doing, and I'm just speaking mostly on a medieval basis. Some of these could include future things like going to shop or spying on a bunch of people in that shopping mall who are plotting against the president, or flying a jetliner, but then the engine blows out and you've got to try to land it safely. In the meantime, there's all this element built up about how many possibilities could happen, all the things that could go wrong. There were unlimited things that movie games could be about. And because they're cinematic based and they're also very gameplay oriented with ever-changing gameplays, that's the key one, ever-changing gameplays. There might be one set gameplay that's your usual, which would be fairly basic, like just a human being walking around, first person or third person or whatever, it almost doesn't matter, but you probably have a fairly set gameplay, and maybe you can use a gun and a sword and a broom and a push cart, and you can talk. That's about your set gameplay, but in the meantime, the gameplay can very much vary. Just like real life. Don't forget, real life can very much vary. One day, you're driving your car. Next day, you're climbing a hydro pole to get a cat down. Next day, you're up on top of the house roof cleaning out the chimney. Next day, you're shoveling snow. Next day, you're on the beach. Next day, real life very much varies. Priorities vary, and this is how the story of your life progresses. Movie games could very much do this, and movie games should have very much done this. I thought around the year 2005, 2006, games were starting to get to the point where they were getting very complex and a lot was being put into them, but at one point they just decided that it was easier and better for games if they just accepted a fairly linear way of gameplay, which is what they did end up doing. Especially nowadays, after the year, say 2008, which I call the end of the golden age. 2008 was the last year of the golden age of gaming, where games were really good. They were still just games, but they were really good. After 2008, almost every single game accepted the fact that they were never going to become more than games, and that gameplay was really the only thing. Gaming fans dropped off. People who play games now are just considered nerds, and anyone who's not considered a nerd is just someone who is just playing because they, have to do something, right? Life is too boring, you gotta play a game. This is not what games had to become. Bear in mind, we did have the chance to make the ultimate form of storytelling, as I call it the half game, but it's really the movie game, a cinematic game that takes place like a cinematic, but is very much gameplay oriented, and not just one gameplay, many gameplays, the multi-gameplay oriented system. This would have been the ultimate form of storytelling, and this would enthrall fans for years and years to come. Were you to put purchasable items, I'm speaking from a businessman's perspective, were you to put purchasable items in the game, people would still lap it up. I almost wish they wouldn't, because you could easily cheat people, right? But it would still work. Unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever your point of view is, it would still very much work, because these games would be so in-depth and so enthralling and so captivating that you could make one game and it would last 5 years, instead of having to make a sequel the next year just to get a fan base going, or 2 years from now. Instead, you could make a sequel once every 6 years, because the game would just keep paying for itself over and over and over again. And fans would just keep giving it high ratings, and more gamers would come onto this game, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All those loser games that are just zombie killers, or first-person shooters that are just about, World War III, and all these post-apocalyptic games, or these Japanese games that just have way too much flash and pizzazz and spark, and then these American games that are just too boring and there's just nothing to them. They're just like watching paint dry. These games would disappear, and these movie games or half games would become the new standard, and some would be good, some would be bad. Once again, you're always going to get that, but the majority of people you would still get a lot of people who say, I liked Rival Ocean 7. I thought Rival Ocean 7, despite the fact that it was pretty basic and there wasn't really much to it, it still had a lot of it still brought the fans in somehow. It still had that kind of that fan base element to it. And then I didn't like Star Wars The Last Days. I thought Star Wars The Last Days, this movie game, I thought it was really, really bad. They kept trying to add in new gameplays and they were all bad. And, I thought the Jedi were just done terribly and the Sith were done even worse and blah, 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 blah. This would be a common problem. But even for those people who said that, they would still like something about the game because it's just so much like real life, you could almost say. That it's like living in a Star Wars world. You have to almost appreciate just the idea of it. And don't forget, these games... Okay, before I get to it. And then there would be good games where you just say, man, I just loved playing as, Cloud Strife there in Final Fantasy VII August Day or whatever. I just loved the idea of it. I just loved the idea of playing in Midgard, interacting with people, and delivering stuff and running the bar that Cloud runs in the movie Advent Children, and doing all these things. In the meantime, you get bad guys coming into your bar who you've got to beat up or whatever, and or you've got to try to get them to be good guys or whatever. There'll be all this stuff. But I forget which point I was going to make there just a moment ago. Give me a moment to remember, listeners. Be patient. You gotta stop me. I was coming at me and said, hey, Craig, spit it out. What are you doing? But yeah, I mean, half games would just fill the bill for you. Whether you liked them or hated them, you'd have to admit they very much do for you what you wanted them to do. You could be playing any half game for 6-7 months. Even if you didn't really like the thing, you'd just be so interested in the idea of it that you'd be playing it for 6-7 months. This is where gaming was meant to go. It was much better than movies. When gaming was becoming big, movies were dying out. No one was going to movies anymore. Movie theaters just weren't selling that many tickets anymore. No one gave a darn. Movies weren't that good, and games were so much better and so much more entertaining, and they were so good at the time that there was no reason to keep going to the movie theaters. And at this point, the games should have realized that they needed to become half game, half movie. Someone should have made a business decision in the gaming industry where they said, we're going to start making half game, half movies, where they're a movie meets a game, and they're the perfect mixture of both of them. This never happened, and shortly after the golden age therefore only lasted 4 years. The peak of gaming only lasted about 4 years, and after that, games plummeted to the point where there's almost no good games anymore. The good games after the year 2008, you can count on the fingers of just maybe 2 hands. You might get 2 hands filled, but that's not really that much considering there's been hundreds, maybe even thousands of games produced. Oh yeah, I'm sure thousands. There's probably a good 2,000 games produced. Okay, maybe there's a little more than just 10 good games. It does count a little bit on perspective, I suppose, but most of the games are not really that high caliber. And as a result, that's where we are right now. So I will leave you with that thought, and remember that Final Fantasy is pretty good stuff. And I'm signing a pledge to... well, I'm not signing a pledge, but leave it in the comment section below if you think the episodes at the end of Final Fantasy 15, these new 4 episodes that are coming out, episode Noctis, episode Lunafreya, episode Aranea, and episode someone else. Core? Is it Core? Either way, these 4 episodes that are coming out, write it in the comments below if you do not agree with these 4 episodes changing the storyline of Final Fantasy 15. The official story, like it or not, you have to admit it did have a certain element to it. And for these 4 episodes to just change it and just pretend that the storyline didn't happen that way, it's all new, it's really pathetic. So don't do that, Square Enix. So sign it in the comments below and leave your signature in there too. If you don't know how to do that, find out. You gotta come on. This is yeah. So do that. Subscribe, like, and that other thing that everyone always says. Comment. I will see you soon, my very good friends. This has been Gregg Everman of Universe Immersion Radio. I bid you goodbye, and remember me. You just gotta turn this thing. How do you turn this thing off?